All right, so members of the squad recently took a stand against the United States continuing to give military aid, this time in the form of an Iron Dome defense system to Israel as they continue to commit widespread human rights abuses against the Palestinian people. And I think it's important to talk about this, one, because it seems like there's a lot of misinformation that is going around liberal and conservative circles as to how this actually unfolded and what this funding is actually going towards. But we're going to clear a lot of that up, and I think it is important to talk about these things because nobody ever gives enough attention to what is happening between Israel and Palestinians. It is an apartheid. There are war crimes that are being committed. And so it's really important that we continue to bring this story to light. So AOC and the squad defund Israel's Iron Dome defense system from Democrats' $1 billion spending bill. So this is from yesterday, and this is what they did. So Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system will be stripped of $1 billion in U.S. funding after Democrats capitulated to the squad to avoid a government shutdown. And while the funding is expected to be reinstated in a later vote, and it has been as of today, the far left wing of the Democratic Party leveraged the urgency of raising the raising the debt limit to nudge forward its agenda on withholding military aid to Israel. And the move drew bipartisan criticism, of course it did, from both moderate Democrats and Republicans, with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy calling it a capitulation to the anti-Semitic influence of their radical members. So pretty important point here to clear up, okay? It is not anti-Semitic to criticize the government of Israel anymore, that it is Islamophobic to criticize the government of Saudi Arabia, okay? You need to be able to separate criticisms of a government and of a state that is wielding violence through its military and criticisms of a religion or an ethnicity. These are completely separate things, and so anybody who is calling critiques of U.S. aid to Israel in the form of military equipment or funding, anybody who's calling that anti-Semitic is a complete joke and a partisan who doesn't actually have an interest in defining reality as it actually is or having an actual conversation about the consequences of those policies. But continuing on, as the House prepared to consider its short-term government funding bill on Wednesday, Representative Ilhan Omar said the U.S. should not be selling weapons to human rights abuses. So this is what she tweeted out that a lot of people had a problem with. She said, "We sold $175 billion in weapons last year, more than anyone in the world, to some of the worst human rights abusers in the world." So first of all, this could apply to a lot of different countries, right? It could apply to Colombia, it could apply to Saudi Arabia, it could apply to Israel. So really a broad stroke comment there that is accurate and is absolutely based and correct. And she continues saying that here's an idea: don't sell arms to anyone who violates human rights. So shouldn't be anything that's really controversial, right? Let's not sell weapons to people who are going to then use those weapons to commit human rights abuses. Shouldn't be anything complicated, and that is something that absolutely would apply to the government of Israel, as I'm about to show you guys here in a second. But just to give you a perspective on why this Iron Dome defense funding is not purely for defense, here is actually from the legislation itself. For an additional amount for procurement defense-wide, $1 billion to remain available until September 30th, 2024, for the Secretary of Defense to provide to the government of Israel for the procurement of the Iron Dome defense system to counter short-range rocket threats, provided that such funds shall be provided to address emergent requirements in support of Operation Guardian of the Walls. Now, what is Operation Guardian of the Walls? Well, you'll remember this was part of what happened earlier this year when there was a conflict, as the media likes to call it, really an ongoing enforcement of an apartheid and a genocide. But there was a conflict earlier in 2021, back in May, where we had this, and I'm going to break this down just as simply as I can, so it's going to be reductive. But essentially what sparked this entire conflict between Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, as well as the Israeli government, obviously, is, first of all, you have to understand Israel is illegally, under international law, occupying the East Jerusalem portion of Palestinian territory, okay? So in East Jerusalem, Israel's government is illegally occupying them, and there was a court case that was brought forward that was specific to the neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah. And in this neighborhood, there are Palestinians who had lived in those houses for years and years and years, who were being forced out of their homes by police forces, by IDF security forces, and by the government of Israel, illegally, again, being forced out of their homes illegally under international law by an occupying force. And in the wake of that, Palestinians were protesting fairly, okay? You absolutely should have a right to protest that. And in response to those protests, the Israeli government and their security forces proceeded to storm the Al-Aqsa Mosque in East Jerusalem and occupy it and tear gas people who were praying in it on one of the holiest nights in Islam, okay? That is the response they had to justified protests against their illegal occupation and forceful evictions of these families in Sheikh Jarrah. So then they occupy this mosque, and Hamas and the Palestinians tell them, they give them an ultimatum. They say, you can leave this mosque and agree never to invade it again, or we are going to conduct retaliatory strikes against the government of Israel. And so they did. They launched retaliatory strikes towards Israel. The Iron Dome defense system managed to intercept about 90 to 95% of them. Some of them hit Israeli targets. Some of them hit Israeli civilians. And that is obviously terrible and not a good thing by any stretch of the imagination. But you also have to understand, Hamas does not have the technological or military capability to decide where their rockets are going, okay? They are makeshift rockets. The militaries of Palestinians and Hamas versus Israel are not comparable by any stretch of the imagination, okay? It's like having Mike Tyson fight a little baby, okay? Their militaries are not comparable by any stretch of the imagination. And so in response to Hamas launching those retaliatory rockets, the government of Israel proceeds to bombard the Gaza Strip, as they have continued to be doing. But they bombarded the Gaza Strip. The ending result was about 256 dead Palestinians, including dozens and dozens of children who were killed by these Israeli bombs, and about 13 dead Israelis. Okay, so that's what ended up happening because of Operation Guardian of the Walls. Okay, so understand what this means. Okay, hundreds of dead Palestinian civilians. Okay, that's what Israel is calling defensive. All right, so when people talk about this Iron Dome defense system and where this funding is actually going to be going, like to the Operation Guardian of the Walls, it is not going for defense. Okay, it is going to kill Palestinian children. Okay, that is the reality of this situation that nobody seems to be talking about or even giving a shit about. And nonetheless, all of these members of Congress who actually on the second round of voting, where it was passed through the House by a vote of like 420 to 9, are getting absolutely blasted. These people are getting shit on by the entire establishment. So here from one of the former IDF spokespersons, so Avi Mayer, these are the 9 members of Congress who voted against saving Israeli and Palestinian lives by funding the Iron Dome. Again, completely misconstruing what this is actually doing. But Cori Bush, Representative Andre Carson, who I didn't know him, but he's from Indiana's 7th District, Choi for Congress, who again I'm not really familiar with, but apparently is from Illinois as well. Representatives Raul Grijalva, I guess is how you pronounce that. Representatives Thomas Massey, Representative Marie Newman, obviously Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, and Rashida Tlaib. Remember their names. And yes, he's saying this in a negative context, but you absolutely should remember their names because these are the only people who are brave enough to stand up in a moment like this and actually speak out for Palestinian people. Noticeably, there are some names that are missing from this list, namely AOC, Jamal Bowman. What the fuck are y'all doing? I don't know if it's because you're in New York and there's a substantial pro-Zionist movement that is in New York, and so you're afraid to challenge this, but a couple names that are missing from this list who originally did support it, right? AOC initially supported the initial pushback against this funding, but didn't show up, I guess, on the final vote, and I'm not really sure what went on there, and there is actually some weird reporting that's going on that she was like crying as this vote took place, so I don't really know what the fuck's going on with there, but her name is missing from this list, and so all credit to these people for actually having some moral and taking a stand on an issue that is so difficult to take a stand on, especially when the entire media and political establishment is going to be banging down on you essentially in response to this type of a move by them, but they are nonetheless absolutely correct. And so just to give you another reminder of what Israel is doing right now and why they would have a valid justification to oppose giving more military aid to the government of Israel. Well, here from Human Rights Watch, a threshold crossed Israeli authorities and the crimes of apartheid and prosecution. So let's just go read a little bit of the summary here. So about 6.8 million Jewish Israelis and about 6.8 million Palestinians live today between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, an area encompassing Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, the latter made up of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. As you can see from right there, they are the Palestinian territories, the Gaza Strip, and then this is considered Israel by today's standards. And throughout most of this area, Israel is the sole governing power. In remainder, it exercises primary authority alongside limited Palestinian self-rule. And across these areas and in most aspects of life, Israeli authorities methodically privilege Jewish Israelis and discriminate against Palestinians. Laws, policies, and statements by leading Israeli officials make plain that the objective of maintaining Jewish Israeli control over demographics, political power, and land has long guided government policy. And in pursuit of this goal, authorities have dispossessed, confined, forcibly separated, and subjugated Palestinians by virtue of their identity to varying degrees of intensity, and in certain areas, as described in this report, these deprivations are so severe that they may amount to crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. So I'll leave this entire report in the description below if you want to read more of it. But yes, Israel is an apartheid state, as you can see from this report as well. During this recent bombardment campaign having to do with the Guardian of the Walls, Israel appears to have committed war crimes in May conflict with Hamas. Human Rights Watch says, obviously this is not surprising. As I said, they killed dozens and dozens of innocent children, and regardless of what you want to say about Hamas, Israel calls their airstrikes precision airstrikes, okay? I don't think it's precision if you're killing dozens and dozens of children in the process, okay? Remember, 13 around Israelis were killed by Hamas's rockets that they launched, okay? 13. And then 66 children were killed in the retaliation by Israel, okay? So understand the disproportionate nature between their militaries and their military capabilities. These are absolutely war crimes that are being committed against a population that is being confined and subjugated within the Gaza Strip in horrible conditions that, again, Israel has primarily or almost entire control over, okay? So they confine these people in the world's largest open air prison, don't give them the ability to seriously rebuild infrastructure after it is destroyed, and then they subjugate them to endless bombing campaigns that end up wiping out hundreds and hundreds of civilians. So this is the reality of what is on the ground and what this conflict or this war between Palestine and Israel actually looks like. And again, just one more example, UN urges Israel to halt expansion of new illegal settlements, okay? So under international law, the expansion of Israeli settlements into Palestinian territories are illegal, okay? They are illegal, just like the war crimes that they have committed are illegal, just like evicting those families from Sheikh Jarrah and the neighborhood in East Jerusalem, that is illegal, okay? All these things that Israel is doing with the weapons and with the funding that we are giving them and that the squad was just trying to oppose, they are using these to commit widespread human rights abuses, war crimes, and apartheid and persecution of the Palestinian people. So, of course, you should oppose giving more military aid to them. And on top of all of that, I mean, the question that nobody seems to be asking, I heard a couple people bring this up on Twitter, but why can't Israel fund the fucking Iron Dome themselves, okay? Israel is not a poor country, right? They can afford $1 billion to go and support this Iron Dome defense system. If it's purely defensive, why do you need the US to fund this for you? It's just completely ridiculous. But the reality is Israel essentially functions as the United States' most influential and important military base in the world, okay? That's why we give them all of the military aid that we do. That's why 420 members and only 9 opposing pass through funding for something like this, okay? It's because they recognize the strategic importance of having Israel in that region, being an ally, regardless of the crimes that they are committing, regardless of the apartheid, regardless of any of these things. The morality of it does not matter. That's the same reason why we are very close allies with Saudi Arabia. The morality does not matter for these people, okay? The only thing that matters is geopolitical control, and really that's it. I mean, in this region, and that's essentially what Israel is functioning to continue. So listen, these members of the squad that did this, they're brave, even though it was pretty virtue signaling, right? Obviously, it did end up getting passed through, but you gotta come out and you gotta defend them because they are 100% right on this issue. No more military aid to governments or states around the world, any of them that are committing human rights abuses.